people don't belong here. You people are thieves. You need to move out now.
Gate agent drags black girls by hair until their CO mother arrives, and what happened in those brutal minutes will make you question everything you thought you knew about traveling while black in America. Unaccompanied minors in first class, gate agent Brenda Holloway sneered as she examined Zoe and Ivy's boarding passes like they were forgeries. Who paid for these tickets? Your mama? And the way she said mama dripped with such contempt, such venom, such absolute certainty that these two black girls standing in front of her were criminals that 14-year-old Zoe felt her stomach drop even before the accusations fully formed. The words hit Zoe first, then 11-year-old Ivy, both sisters feeling that familiar tightening in their chests that comes when an adult who holds power over you has already decided you're guilty, has already determined that your blackness is proof enough of wrongdoing, has already made up their mind that no matter what documents you present or explanations you offer, you don't belong in first class, don't belong in their space, don't deserve the dignity they'd automatically extend to white children standing in this exact same spot. Now before you scroll past thinking this is some isolated incident from decades ago, before you tell yourself that surely this kind of blatant racism doesn't happen anymore in modern airports with security cameras everywhere, let me shatter that comfortable illusion right now. This happened last year, in a major American airport, in front of hundreds of witnesses, and it's not just alive but thriving, not just surviving but evolving, learning to hide behind professional smiles and claims of following protocol while it destroys black children who committed no crime except existing in spaces white gatekeepers have decided don't belong to them. Zoe looked at Brenda Holloway with eyes that had seen this before, not this exact scenario but variations of it, the suspicious store clerks who followed them through aisles, the teachers who assumed they'd cheated on tests they'd aced, the security guards who demanded to see receipts other kids never had to produce. She wasn't surprised that this 51-year-old white woman in an airline uniform looked at her and Ivy's beautiful cornrows with gold beads, at their matching outfits, at their carefully organized documents, and saw thieves instead of excited girls traveling to their cousin's Sweet 16. But Ivy, sweet Ivy who still believed most adults were good, who trusted that following rules meant safety, who'd spent the car ride to the airport chattering about seeing their cousins and dancing at the party, Ivy's face showed confusion giving way to fear as Brenda's accusations grew louder, as the gate agent called them welfare cases and ghetto and said she'd seen their type before. As passengers began gathering to watch two black girls being publicly humiliated while their phones came out to record but their mouths stayed shut. They were standing at gate 47 of a bustling terminal, surrounded by travelers heading to Los Angeles and Phoenix and Seattle, surrounded by families and business people and college students, surrounded by humanity that chose to be audience instead of allies. Zoe clutched their boarding passes in hands that had started trembling. Ivy pressed close to her older sister seeking protection Zoe didn't know how to provide, and Brenda Holloway smiled with the particular satisfaction of someone who'd found legitimate targets for the racism she'd been nursing her entire 51 years. "Ma'am, please," Zoe tried one more time, her voice shaking but still polite because her mother had taught her to stay calm in difficult situations, to never give them an excuse, to maintain composure even when the world was trying to break you. "You can verify our tickets in the system. Our mother purchased them 6 weeks ago. We have all our documentation. We're expected in Los Angeles." "Don't tell me how to do my job," Brenda hissed, stepping closer, using her adult body to intimidate children, using her uniform to weaponize authority, using her whiteness as a shield against consequences she assumed would never come. "I've seen you people before, dress nice, talk polite, but underneath, thieves, liars, you're all the same." Around them passengers shifted uncomfortably, a white mother pulled her children closer and hurried past. A businessman checked his watch annoyed at the delay. A young woman held up her phone filming but said nothing, did nothing, chose documentation over intervention, chose content over courage, chose to bear witness from a safe distance rather than use her body or voice to stop what everyone could see was wrong. Ivy started crying, quiet tears streaming down her face, her small hand reaching for Zoe's, her voice breaking as she whispered, "I want mama. I just want mama." And that's when Brenda Holloway noticed their hair. If you believe no child should ever be dragged by their hair in an airport, keep watching because what happens next will haunt you. If you think racial profiling is something we left in the 1960s, You need to see the security footage that's about to play out. And if you've ever been treated like a criminal because of your skin color, drop a comment below. Tell us your story, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is right now. We're reading every single one. This story doesn't end the way you think. Hit that like button if you stand against racism. Subscribe to this channel because we're exposing the incidents that airlines pray you'll never see. And trust me, what this gate agent does next will make you weep with rage. But to understand how two sisters ended up standing at gate 47 being accused of crimes they didn't commit by a woman who decided their blackness was evidence enough, we need to go back 18 hours to when this trip was supposed to be nothing but joy and celebration. Back to when Zoe and Ivy's biggest worry was whether they'd packed enough outfits for their cousin Maya's sweet 16 party in Los Angeles. Zoe Turner was 14 years old, a freshman at Martin Luther King Jr. High School where she maintained a 3.9 GPA and captained the debate team, a kid who spent her weekends volunteering at the community center and her evenings helping her little sister with homework. She was responsible and mature beyond her years, the kind of teenager parents trusted with house keys and younger siblings, the kind of student teachers wrote glowing recommendation letters about, the kind of daughter who made her mother's eyes shine with pride every time someone complimented her intelligence or work ethic. Ivy was 11, in 6th grade, all energy and laughter and the kind of innocent optimism that hadn't yet been beaten down by the world's cruelty. She loved science and dance in equal measure, could explain photosynthesis while demonstrating a perfect pirouette, spent her allowance on books about space exploration and sparkly hair accessories. She was the baby of the family, protected and adored, still young enough to believe that kindness was common and fairness was guaranteed and that adults in uniforms existed to keep children safe. Their mother Victoria Palmer had raised them alone since their father died in a car accident when Ivy was 3 and Zoe was 6, had built a life and a career through sheer determination and brilliance and the kind of relentless work ethic that turned a small beauty product idea into Luminance Beauty, one of the most successful Black-owned cosmetics companies in America. But Zoe and Ivy didn't fully grasp the scope of their mother's success, didn't understand that the big company she ran employed thousands of people, didn't realize that her face graced magazine covers and her opinions shaped industry standards. To them, she was just Mama, the woman who worked long hours but never missed a school play, who traveled frequently for business but always called to say goodnight, who somehow balanced running a corporation with braiding their hair and checking their homework and making sure they knew they were loved beyond measure. The night before their flight, Victoria had spent 3 hours on their hair, her skilled fingers weaving intricate cornrows that started at their hairlines and flowed down their backs in perfect parallel rows, each braid adorned with gold beads that clicked softly with movement and caught the light like tiny stars. It was a labor of love, a cultural inheritance, a statement that said we are beautiful, we are worthy, we carry our ancestors' artistry in every strand. Ivy had sat between her mother's knees watching cartoons while Victoria worked, occasionally wincing when the comb caught a tangle but mostly just enjoying this ritual that connected her to her mother and grandmother and all the Black women who'd come before, all the hands that had braided and twisted and adorned, all the love that had been woven into hair across generations. "You're going to be the most beautiful girls at that party," Victoria had said as she tied off the last braid, added the final beads, stepped back to admire her work, and remember babies, your hair is your crown, don't let anybody make you feel like you need to hide it or change it or apologize for it. Zoe had looked in the mirror and smiled at her reflection, at the hours of her mother's time and skill displayed in perfect geometric rows, at the gold beads that made her feel regal and special and connected to something bigger than herself. "Thank you, Mama," she'd said, hugging Victoria tight. "We look like queens." "You are queens," Victoria had responded, pulling both daughters close, "and don't you ever forget it." That morning at the airport, Victoria had walked them all the way to security even though she was already running late for a board meeting, had gone through their documents one more time making sure everything was in order, had reminded them of the emergency protocols and the backup phone Zoe carried in her sock and the importance of staying together no matter what. "This is your first time flying alone," Victoria had said, kneeling so she could look both girls in the eyes, her hands on their shoulders, her expression serious but loving, "and I need you to be smart and careful and look out for each other. If anything feels wrong, anything at all, you call me immediately. I don't care if I'm in a meeting or on a call or talking to the president, You call me and Mama will handle it. We'll be fine, Mama, Zoe had assured her with the confidence of a 14-year-old who'd never yet encountered a problem she couldn't solve with politeness and proper procedure. We have everything organized, all our documents are perfect, we know the plan. Victoria had hugged them both so tight Ivy squeaked in protest, had kissed their foreheads and adjusted the gold beads in their braids one last time, had watched them go through security with that mixture of pride and worry every parent feels sending their children into the world alone. She'd stood there until they disappeared around the corner toward the gates, had whispered a prayer for their safety, had told herself she was being overprotective because nothing bad could happen in a busy airport in broad daylight surrounded by hundreds of witnesses. She'd been wrong about that, catastrophically wrong, but she wouldn't know it until her phone rang 2 hours later with Zoe sobbing on the other end. The girls had made it through security without incident, had found their gate with 45 minutes to spare, had settled into chairs near the boarding area with their matching backpacks and their excited chatter about seeing their cousins. They'd FaceTimed with Maya, who was bouncing around her house in Los Angeles showing them the party decorations and her dress and the playlist she'd curated, had sent their mother a selfie with the caption "Made it to the gate safe" and sound with heart emojis. Everything had been fine, better than fine, exactly as planned, two responsible girls on their way to a family celebration with proper tickets and documentation and a mother's love braided into their hair. Then Brenda Holloway had started her shift at Gate 47, had taken her position behind the desk with 23 years of gate agent experience and a lifetime of racial resentment, had looked out at the waiting passengers and seen Zoe and Ivy in their matching outfits and beautiful braids, had made a decision in that moment that would destroy her career and traumatize two children and prove that racism wasn't dead or even dormant but alive and vicious and waiting for any excuse to strike. When boarding began and first-class passengers were called, Zoe and Ivy had gathered their things and joined the line, their boarding passes ready, their excitement building because they'd never flown first class before, their mother had surprised them with the upgrade as a treat, had wanted their first solo flight to be comfortable and special. Brenda had watched them approach her desk and something had twisted in her expression, some combination of disbelief and disgust and rage that two black girls would dare to present first-class boarding passes, would dare to act like they belonged in the premium cabin, would dare to exist in a space Brenda's worldview had reserved for people who looked like her. "You too," she'd snapped, pointing at them like they were problems instead of passengers, "step aside." That's when everything had started to unravel, when Zoe's confident smile had faltered, when Ivy's excitement had curdled into confusion, when two girls who'd done everything right were about to learn that doing everything right doesn't protect you when someone with power has decided your blackness is crime enough. Zoe had responded to Brenda's command to step aside with the kind of practiced politeness that black parents drill into their children, the tone that says "I'm not a threat, I'm complying, please don't hurt me." "Ma'am, is something wrong?" she'd asked, her voice steady even though her heart was already racing. "We have our boarding passes right here." Brenda had snatched the documents from Zoe's outstretched hand with enough force to make the 14-year-old flinch, had held them up to the fluorescent terminal lights like she was examining evidence at a crime scene, her face twisted with the kind of theatrical suspicion designed to humiliate. "Unaccompanied minors in first class," she'd announced loud enough for everyone in the gate area to hear. "Who paid for these tickets?" "Our mama," Ivy had answered softly, her 11-year-old voice still carrying that innocent trust that adults asked questions because they genuinely wanted answers, that authority figures were there to help, that telling the truth would make everything okay. Brenda had laughed then, a cold, ugly sound that made both girls' stomachs drop, made them understand in that moment that this woman didn't want answers, she wanted a spectacle, she wanted an excuse. "Your mama bought first-class tickets for two kids flying alone," she'd said, her voice dripping with disbelief and contempt. "These are stolen, I'm calling security." The accusation hit Zoe like a physical blow because they'd done everything right, had followed every rule, had triple-checked their documents, had been so careful and prepared and responsible. "They're not stolen," she'd said, hearing her voice start to shake despite her efforts to stay calm. "Please, you can verify them in the system. Our mother purchased them 6 weeks ago. Everything is legitimate." "Don't tell me how to do my job," Brenda had snapped, stepping closer, using her adult height to tower over them in a way that felt deliberately intimidating, deliberately designed to make two children feel small and powerless and afraid. "I've seen your type before," she'd continued, her eyes traveling over their matching outfits and carefully braided hair with naked disgust. Dress nice, talk polite, but underneath, thieves, liars, you people are all the same. The phrase "you people" hung in the air like a slap, and Ivy had started trembling, her small hand reaching for Zoe's, squeezing tight like her older sister could somehow protect her from words that cut deeper than any physical weapon. Around them the gate area continued its normal rhythm, passengers checking phones and buying coffee and gathering their belongings for boarding, the world going on as if two black girls weren't being publicly accused of crimes they didn't commit by a woman whose uniform gave her the power to destroy them. A white family had walked past right then, the mother glancing at the commotion, at Brenda's aggressive posture and the girls' frightened faces, and for a moment Zoe had felt hope flicker that maybe this woman would intervene, would use her whiteness as a shield, would say something to stop this. But the mother had pulled her children closer instead and hurried away, had chosen her family's comfort over two strangers' crisis, had decided that whatever was happening to those black girls wasn't her problem or her business or her responsibility. For 20 excruciating minutes Brenda had interrogated them right there in the middle of the terminal, had demanded to know where they really got the tickets, had accused them of pickpocketing, had insisted on searching their bags even though she had no legal authority to do so. She'd dumped the contents of Ivy's backpack onto the floor, had held up the 11-year-old's science homework and clean underwear and strawberry lip gloss like they were evidence of wrongdoing, had called them ghetto and welfare cases and said she knew exactly what kind of families produced children like this. Zoe had tried to stay calm the way her mother had taught her, had tried to remember that losing her temper would only make things worse, that giving this woman an excuse to claim they'd been aggressive or threatening would justify whatever came next. "Ma'am, please," she'd said, her voice breaking now despite her best efforts. "Our mother is expecting us to call when we board. She'll be worried if she doesn't hear from us. Can we just contact her to verify everything?" "Call her so she can coach you on your lies," Brenda had sneered, and then she'd done something that made Zoe's blood run cold, had reached out and grabbed Zoe's phone right from her hand, had taken away their ability to contact the one person who could help them, had isolated them completely. "No calls," Brenda had announced. "You're staying right here until security arrives to process you for theft and fraud." Ivy had started crying then, quiet sobs that shook her small shoulders, tears streaming down her face as the reality of their situation finally penetrated her 11-year-old optimism. "I want my mama," she'd whispered, her voice small and broken. "Please, I just want my mama." "Stop that sniveling," Brenda had hissed, her disgust at a child's tears so naked and vicious it made nearby passengers shift uncomfortably. "Crocodile tears won't work on me. I know all your tricks." More passengers had passed during those 20 minutes of public humiliation, some staring openly, some pretending not to notice, some pulling out phones to record because apparently witnessing injustice through a screen was easier than stopping it with their voices. A young white woman had lingered nearby, her face showing discomfort at what she was seeing, but when Zoe made eye contact, silently begging for help, the woman had looked away and kept walking, had chosen her own comfort over intervention, had decided that whatever was happening to these black girls wasn't worth the social awkwardness of getting involved. An elderly black man had walked past and Zoe had felt desperate hope because surely he would understand, surely he would recognize what was happening, surely generational solidarity would compel him to speak up. He'd shaken his head sadly, his eyes full of recognition and grief, but he'd kept walking too, and Zoe understood in that moment that even shared trauma doesn't always translate to shared courage, that survival sometimes means keeping your head down and thanking God it's not you this time. A businessman had stopped long enough to check his watch with obvious annoyance, irritated that this scene was delaying his boarding, that these girls and their drama were inconveniencing his schedule, and he'd actually huffed loudly at Brenda like she should hurry up and resolve this situation so the rest of them could get on the plane. Not one word of concern for what two children were experiencing, just impatience that their suffering was taking too long. Through it all Brenda had kept up her interrogation, had demanded to know where their father was, had suggested their mother probably didn't know they'd stolen her credit card, had implied that children from their kind of background couldn't possibly afford first-class tickets through legitimate means. She'd searched through their bags again, had examined their clothes and toiletries like looking for proof they were too poor to own nice things, had held up Ivy's stuffed elephant that she'd packed for comfort and made a comment about how they were clearly too immature to be traveling alone. Then Brenda's eyes had landed on their hair, on the intricate cornrows that Victoria had spent 3 hours creating the night before, on the gold beads that caught the terminal lights and clicked softly when the girls moved, on the hours of love and cultural heritage woven into every braid. "What is this?" Brenda had said, flicking one of Ivy's braids with her finger like it was something dirty, something offensive, something that needed to be commented on and criticized. "This isn't appropriate for air travel," she'd announced, her voice loud enough to draw more stares. "You look like you belong on a street corner, not an airplane." The insult had landed like a bomb, the implications so clear and so vicious that even some of the bystanders had gasped. Ivy had flinched away from Brenda's hand, had brought her own hands up protectively to her hair, to the braids her mother had done with such care and love. "My mama did my hair," she'd said, her voice trembling. "Please don't touch it." And that's when something had snapped in Brenda Holloway, when whatever thin veneer of professionalism she'd been maintaining had crumbled completely, when her racism had gone from verbal to physical, when she'd made the decision that would end her career and traumatize 2 children and prove that hatred doesn't just wound with words. Brenda's hand had shot out faster than Ivy could react, her fingers closing around a fistful of the girl's carefully braided cornrows, and then she'd yanked with enough force to jerk Ivy's entire head backward at a violent angle that made her neck crack. The scream that came out of Ivy's 11-year-old throat was pure agony, the sound of a child experiencing pain she'd never imagined an adult would deliberately inflict, the sound of innocence being shattered in real time in a crowded airport terminal while hundreds of people watched. Gold beads scattered across the terminal floor like tiny fallen stars, bouncing and rolling under seats and into corners, each one representing a piece of the 3 hours Victoria had spent the night before weaving love into her daughter's hair. Ivy's scalp burned with searing pain as Brenda's grip tightened, as strands of hair were ripped from tender follicles, as the braids that had made her feel like royalty that morning became weapons used to hurt her. "No," Zoe had screamed, lunging forward to protect her baby sister, to put her own body between Ivy and this woman who'd transformed from intimidating authority figure into physical threat. But Brenda had been ready for that, had released Ivy only to grab Zoe instead, her hand twisting into the 14-year-old's cornrows with the same vicious force. Zoe's knees had buckled as Brenda dragged her sideways by her hair, pain exploding across her scalp as she was pulled off balance, her hands coming up instinctively to try to ease the pressure but finding no relief because Brenda's grip was iron, was deliberate, was designed to inflict maximum pain and humiliation. "You want to fight me?" Brenda had hissed, her face close enough that Zoe could smell her coffee breath. "I'll show you what happens to little thugs who resist." She dragged both girls then, Ivy by one fistful of braids and Zoe by another, pulling them across the terminal toward a security holding area while they cried and stumbled and tried desperately not to fall because falling meant more hair ripped out, more pain, more damage to the crowns their mother had created with such love. Passengers had parted to let them through like the Red Sea, had created a path for this violence, had stepped aside to give Brenda room to assault 2 children in broad daylight. Phones had come out everywhere, a dozen people filming, capturing every second of this brutality from multiple angles, getting clear footage of a uniformed gate agent dragging crying children by their hair, documenting evidence that would later fill courtrooms and news feeds and the nightmares of everyone who witnessed it. A small child had asked her mother, "Why is that lady hurting those girls?" Her voice loud in the sudden quiet that had fallen over the gate area, and the mother had shushed her quickly, had told her to look away, had chosen to shield her own child's eyes rather than use her adult voice to stop the violence happening right in front of them. No one had moved, no one had spoken up, no one had stepped forward to say this is wrong or let those children go or I'm calling the police. No one had been willing to transform from observer to participant, from witness to ally, from someone who saw injustice to someone who stopped it. They just watched and filmed and stayed silent while 2 black girls were dragged across a terminal by their hair, while their screams echoed off the high ceilings, while gold beads marked a trail of destruction across the polished floor. Brenda had thrown them into plastic chairs in a small windowless holding room, her chest heaving from exertion and rage, and both girls had looked up at her with faces streaked with tears and terror, their beautiful braids now destroyed, hanging loose and crooked, some pulled completely out with small patches of blood visible on their tender scalps where hair had been ripped from the roots. Ivy's hands had gone to her head instinctively, touching the ruined cornrows, feeling the sticky warmth of blood, realizing that the crown her mother had spent hours creating was gone, was destroyed, was scattered across a terminal floor like garbage. Stay here until security processes you for theft and assault on an airline employee, Brenda had spat, and that last accusation was perhaps the cruelest because now she was claiming these children she just brutalized had somehow assaulted her, was setting up a narrative where she was the victim defending herself against aggressive black girls who'd forced her to use physical force. Your mama should have taught you better, she'd added, and then she'd slammed the door, leaving them alone in that small room with nothing but their pain and fear and each other. The girls had huddled together in those plastic chairs, Zoe wrapping her arms around Ivy's shaking body, both of them sobbing now, all pretense of staying calm abandoned because what was the point of composure when the world had just proven it didn't matter how polite you were or how well you followed rules or how perfectly you presented yourself. Zoe, it hurts so bad, Ivy had whimpered, her hands still touching her scalp, still finding new spots where hair had been torn out, still discovering the full extent of the damage. Mama's going to be so sad. She worked so hard on our hair. I know, baby, Zoe had whispered, her own tears falling into her sister's ruined braids. I know. And what she didn't say was that she felt like she'd failed, like as the older sister she should have protected Ivy somehow, should have prevented this, should have been strong enough or smart enough or brave enough to stop a grown woman from hurting her baby sister. For 47 minutes they'd sat alone in that holding room, the minutes crawling by like hours, every sound outside the door making them tense with fear that Brenda was coming back, that security was coming to arrest them, that somehow this nightmare was going to get even worse. They'd cried until they had no tears left, had held each other until their arms ached, had whispered reassurances neither of them believed that Mama would fix this, that everything would be okay, that surely someone would realize a mistake had been made. Ivy had fallen into an exhausted silence after a while, her head resting on Zoe's shoulder, her breathing still hitching with leftover sobs, her fingers absently touching the destroyed braids like she couldn't quite believe they were real. Zoe had stared at the blank wall across from them and felt something shifting inside her, some fundamental understanding about the world crystallizing in a way that would change her forever, the knowledge that being good wasn't enough, that following rules wasn't protection, that sometimes hatred won simply because good people chose silence over courage. Then she'd remembered the backup phone, the old device Victoria had insisted she carried tucked in her sock, the emergency failsafe her mother had put in place because Victoria Palmer didn't leave anything to chance, didn't trust that systems would protect her daughters, didn't assume the world would be fair. With trembling hands Zoe had reached down and pulled the phone from her sock, had turned it on with fingers that shook so badly she almost dropped it, had dialed her mother's number and prayed that somehow Victoria could fix what felt completely unfixable. The phone had rung twice before Victoria answered, her voice professional and distracted because she'd been in a meeting, because she'd assumed her daughters were safely on a plane by now, because she'd had no reason to expect the call that was about to destroy her composure and unleash a fury that would shake an entire corporation. Zoe baby, she'd said, is everything okay? And Zoe's carefully maintained composure had finally shattered completely, had broken into pieces as jagged as the beads scattered across the terminal floor, and through heaving sobs she'd told her mother everything, the accusations and the slurs and the interrogation and the way Brenda had grabbed their hair, had dragged them, had ripped their braids apart, had made them bleed, had locked them in this room like criminals, like they were nothing, like they didn't matter. And if you're watching this and you haven't subscribed yet, if you think this kind of violence against black children is rare or exaggerated or something from the past, then you need to stay until the end because what happens next will show you exactly what power looks like when a mother who's been underestimated her entire life decides that enough is enough. Hit that subscribe button right now because we're exposing the racism that hides behind uniforms and policies and the assumption that black girls are easy targets, and trust me, you don't want to miss what their CEO mother does when she arrives. Victoria had been sitting in the boardroom of Luminance Beauty's Atlanta headquarters when her phone rang, surrounded by 12 executives discussing the launch strategy for their new skincare line, her laptop open with quarterly projections and market analysis spreadsheets, her mind fully engaged in the kind of high-level decision-making that had built her company from a dream into a multi-million-dollar empire. She'd glanced at the caller ID and seen Zoe's backup number, the one her daughter only used in genuine emergencies, and her stomach had dropped even before she answered. "Zoe baby, is everything okay?" she'd said, already standing, already moving toward the door, already knowing from the choice of phone that something was very wrong. And then Zoe had started talking through sobs so intense Victoria could barely understand the words, her 14-year-old daughter's voice breaking on every syllable as she described being accused of theft, being called ghetto and welfare cases, being told they looked like street corner trash, and Victoria's hands had started shaking with a rage so profound it felt like her entire body was vibrating. The executives in the boardroom had watched their CEO's face transform from professional composure to barely controlled fury, had seen her grip the phone so tight her knuckles went white, had witnessed the exact moment Victoria Palmer stopped being a corporate executive and became a mother whose children were in danger. Then Zoe had gotten to the part about the hair, about Brenda grabbing Ivy's braids and yanking, about the beads scattering, about being dragged across the terminal by the cornrows Victoria had spent 3 hours creating with her own hands the night before, about blood on their scalps and destroyed braids and sitting locked in a holding room for 47 minutes, and Victoria had felt something crack inside her chest, some barrier between her professional self and her protective mother self. Shattering completely. The silence on Victoria's end of the call had stretched for 5 seconds that felt like eternity to Zoe, 5 seconds where the 14-year-old had wondered if maybe her mother was angry at them, if maybe they'd done something wrong, if maybe calling had been a mistake. Then Victoria's voice had come back, transformed from the warm maternal tone into something cold and sharp as a blade, something that carried the weight of every glass ceiling she'd shattered and every obstacle she'd demolished and every person who'd ever underestimated her power. "Are you safe right now?" Victoria had asked, her voice deadly calm. "Is Ivy with you?" "Yes, Mama," Zoe had whispered. "We're together but they won't let us leave. We're locked in this room." "Listen to me carefully, baby," Victoria had said, and Zoe could hear movement in the background, could hear her mother's heels clicking rapidly across the floor, could hear car keys jangling, could hear the sounds of Victoria Palmer mobilizing with the kind of focused intensity she usually reserved for hostile corporate takeovers. "Stay in that room, hold your sister, don't speak to anyone else. Mama is coming, and baby, that woman will never hurt another child again, I promise you that." The call had ended and Zoe had looked at Ivy through fresh tears, had pulled her little sister closer and whispered, "Mama's coming. She's going to fix this," even though part of her couldn't quite imagine how their mother could fix something this broken, this wrong, this terrible. Ivy had nodded against Zoe's shoulder, her hands still touching her ruined braids, still cataloging the damage, still trying to process that a grown woman had deliberately hurt her, had ripped out her hair, had destroyed something beautiful her mother had made. What Brenda Holloway didn't know as she stood at the gate desk 47 minutes after locking 2 black girls in a holding room, what she couldn't have known because she'd made assumptions based on skin color rather than investigating reality, was that Victoria Palmer wasn't just any mother, wasn't just another black woman who could be intimidated or dismissed or ignored. Victoria's face had graced the covers of Forbes and Essence and Business Weekly. Her company employed over 3,000 people across 6 states. Her products sat on shelves in every major retailer from Target to Sephora to Nordstrom. Her net worth had crossed into 9 figures 2 years ago. And her closest friend since college, her sorority sister, her daughter's godmother, the woman who'd been in Victoria's wedding and held her hand through her husband's funeral and celebrated every milestone of her company's growth, was Diane Richardson, the CEO of the very airline whose gate agent had just committed assault on 2 minors in a holding room at Gate 47. Victoria had made one phone call from her car while running every red light between her office and the airport, her Bluetooth connected, her voice tight with controlled fury. "Diane," she'd said when her friend answered, "my daughters are being held at Gate 47 of your airport. A gate agent named Brenda Holloway dragged them by their hair. They're bleeding. I'm 20 minutes away. I need you to handle this until I get there." The response had been immediate, Diane's own voice shifting from friendly greeting to corporate crisis mode in half a second. "I'm calling the terminal director now," she'd said. "That agent is finished, Victoria. I promise you she's finished. I'm pulling security footage. I'm getting statements. I'm making sure everything is documented before you even arrive." "Good," Victoria had said, her foot pressing harder on the accelerator, her BMW weaving through traffic with the kind of reckless determination that comes when your children are hurt and every second of distance feels like abandonment. Because when I get there, Diane, I'm going to want her arrested, I'm going to want her prosecuted, I'm going to want her face on every news channel in this country so every parent knows what she did to my babies. She'd made the 20-minute drive in 17, had abandoned her car in a loading zone with the engine still running, had sprinted through the terminal in 4-inch heels with security guards parting before her because something in her face made it clear that getting in her way would be a catastrophic mistake. She'd known where to go because Diane had texted her the exact location, had known that her daughters were behind a door marked security hold, had known that somewhere nearby the woman who'd hurt them was probably going about her day like she hadn't just committed a felony. Victoria had burst through the holding room door and the sight that met her eyes would haunt her for the rest of her life, would appear in her nightmares and her moments of quiet reflection, would become the image she saw every time someone tried to tell her racism wasn't that bad anymore or things had gotten better or she was being too sensitive. Her daughters had looked up from where they sat huddled together in plastic chairs, their faces tear-streaked and frightened, their beautiful braids destroyed and hanging in ruined strands, Ivy's scalp showing small patches of blood where hair had been violently ripped out, both of them looking so young and so broken and so utterly traumatized that Victoria had felt her heart shatter into 1,000 pieces. She dropped to her knees in front of them, her expensive suit hitting the dirty floor without a thought, and pulled both girls into her arms with a fierce protectiveness that came from every maternal instinct evolution had programmed into her DNA. "Mama's here," she'd whispered into their hair, into the ruins of the braids she'd created with such love. "Mama's here, you're safe now, nobody's going to hurt you ever again." Ivy had sobbed into Victoria's chest, her small body shaking with the kind of crying that comes from trauma finally finding safe space to release. "She ruined our hair, Mama," Ivy had wailed. "The hair you did for us. She called us thieves. She said we looked like we belonged on a street corner," and hearing her 11-year-old daughter repeat those venomous words had made Victoria want to scream, want to break things, want to destroy the woman who dared to speak to her children this way. But Victoria Palmer hadn't built an empire by losing control, hadn't shattered glass ceilings by giving in to rage no matter how justified, hadn't survived and thrived in hostile boardrooms by showing her opponents the full extent of her fury. So she'd held her daughters and stroked their ruined braids and let them cry, and when she'd finally spoken her voice had been steady and certain and carrying a promise she fully intended to keep. "Your hair will grow back, baby," Victoria had said quietly, "but her career won't." Victoria had stayed on the floor holding her daughters for 3 full minutes, long enough for their sobs to quiet slightly, long enough for them to feel the safety of her presence after 47 minutes of terror, long enough for her own rage to crystallize from hot emotion into cold, strategic fury. She'd examined their scalps with gentle fingers, cataloging every injury, every patch of torn hair, every spot where blood had dried in the ruins of her careful braiding, and with each new discovery her resolve had hardened into something diamond-sharp and unbreakable. "Tell me everything," Victoria had said softly, and this time Zoe had been able to get through the story with fewer tears because Mama was here, because they were safe now, because the nightmare was ending even if its effects would linger forever. She told her mother about the initial accusations, about being pulled aside and interrogated, about Brenda calling them thieves and welfare cases, about the phone being taken away, about 20 minutes of public humiliation while passengers watched and filmed but nobody helped. And then Ivy had taken over, her voice small and broken, telling her mother about the comment about their hair, about Brenda saying they looked like street corner trash, about the grab and the yank and the pain and the beads scattering and being dragged across the terminal while people just stood there watching. "She worked so hard on our braids, Mama," Ivy had whispered, "and that lady just ripped them out like they were nothing, like we were nothing." Victoria's jaw had clenched so tight it hurt, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed back what remained of Ivy's cornrows, her mind already 3 steps ahead planning exactly how Brenda Holloway's life was about to be dismantled piece by systematic piece. "You are not nothing," she'd said fiercely, looking both daughters in the eyes. "You are everything, you are queens, and that woman is going to learn what happens when someone tries to take a queen's crown." She'd stood then, helping both girls to their feet, and taken each of their hands in hers with a grip that was both gentle and absolutely unbreakable. "We're going to walk out of this room together," Victoria had said, "and we're going to find the woman who did this to you, and you're going to watch Mama handle it, because I want you to see that our power doesn't come from being liked or accepted or fitting into white people's comfort zones. Our power comes from knowing our worth and demanding that the world recognize it. They'd walked out of that holding room together, Victoria in the middle with a daughter on each side, moving through the terminal with the kind of presence that made people instinctively step aside even before they recognized who she was. The terminal director had been waiting outside, flanked by 2 airline executives and 3 airport security officers, all of them looking varying degrees of concerned and professionally apologetic, all of them knowing they were about to witness something significant. Mrs. Palmer, the terminal director had started, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone trying to de-escalate a situation that was already far beyond de-escalation. I cannot express how sorry we are about what happened to your daughters. We're conducting a full investigation and... Where is she? Victoria had interrupted, her voice quiet but carrying enough authority that the terminal director had stopped mid-sentence. Where is the woman who assaulted my children? She's at the gate desk, one of the executives had said nervously. We've been instructed not to confront her until you arrived. The CEO wanted you to be present for. Good, Victoria had said, and started walking toward gate 47 with her daughters still holding her hands, the entourage of officials trailing behind her like a corporate SWAT team, everyone moving with the inevitability of a glacier, slow and unstoppable and capable of reshaping entire landscapes. Brenda had been at the gate desk laughing with a colleague when they'd rounded the corner, her body language relaxed and satisfied, clearly enjoying some joke about the situation she'd just handled, completely unaware that the universe was about to deliver consequences with the force of a freight train. She'd been mid-laugh when she'd turned and seen the group approaching, when she'd seen Victoria Palmer in an expensive suit flanked by terminal brass and security, when she'd seen Zoe and Ivy with their destroyed hair and tear-stained faces, when the full magnitude of her mistake had begun to register on her face. The smile had drained from Brenda's expression like water from a broken glass, color following shortly after, her hand going to her throat in an unconscious gesture of fear as she'd recognized that something was very wrong, that these weren't just 2 random black girls she could bully with impunity, that she'd miscalculated in a way that was about to cost her everything. Ms. Holloway, the terminal director had said formally, his voice carrying through the gate area and making nearby passengers turn to watch this new drama. These are the children you detained approximately 1 hour ago. Is that correct? Yes, Brenda had started, her voice uncertain now, stripped of its earlier contempt and authority. I caught them with stolen tickets and their tickets have been verified, the terminal director had interrupted, purchased 6 weeks ago by their mother, and he gestured to Victoria with a slight inclination of his head. This is Victoria Palmer, CEO of Luminance Beauty, and a personal friend of our CEO Diane Richardson who is currently watching this interaction via security feed as we speak. Brenda's face had gone from pale to ash white, all the blood draining as the full scope of her catastrophic error had hit her in waves, each realization worse than the last, each piece of information another nail in the coffin of her career. She'd opened her mouth but no sound had come out, her brain unable to process fast enough to mount any kind of defense, her body frozen in the spotlight of her own hatred coming home to roost. Victoria had stepped forward then, not rushing, not aggressive, just moving with the calm certainty of someone who held all the power and knew exactly how to use it. Her voice when she'd spoken had been quiet enough that people had to strain to hear, but somehow that quietness had been more devastating than shouting, more final than rage. You dragged my children by their hair, Victoria had said, each word precisely enunciated, each syllable carrying the weight of maternal fury filtered through corporate discipline. Hair I braided myself with my own hands, hair that represents our culture and our heritage and our love. You ripped it from their scalps, you made them bleed, you called them thieves and ghetto and street corner trash. You locked them in a room for 47 minutes while they cried for me. She'd paused, letting the accusations hang in the air, letting everyone within earshot absorb exactly what Brenda had done. My 11-year-old daughter has blood on her scalp right now because you couldn't stand seeing black girls in first class, Victoria had continued, her eyes locked on Brenda's face, watching every micro-expression of fear and realization and dawning horror, because you looked at my babies and saw criminals instead of children, because your racism was more important to you than their humanity. I didn't know, Brenda had stammered, finding her voice but not her composure. "I thought I was just." "You thought they were easy targets," Victoria had said, her voice cutting through Brenda's excuses like a scalpel. "You thought no one would believe them. You thought their mother was nobody. You thought you could brutalize black children and face no consequences because that's how it's always worked for people like you." She turned to the terminal director then, her posture shifting from grieving mother to CEO making executive decisions. "I want her terminated immediately," Victoria had said. "I want her arrested for assault on minors. I want her prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, and I want her face on every news outlet in this country so no child ever suffers at her hands again." The terminal director had nodded and gestured to security without hesitation. "Take her into custody." The security officers had moved forward with practiced efficiency, one on each side of Brenda, their hands going to her arms as they began reading her rights in voices that carried across the suddenly silent gate area. "You have the right to remain an attorney," the words that every American knows from television but that sound completely different when they're being applied to you, when your career and freedom are being stripped away in real time in front of hundreds of witnesses. "This is discrimination," Brenda had screamed, her voice rising to a pitch that bordered on hysterical as the reality of her situation fully penetrated her shock. "You can't do this to me. I have rights. I was just doing my job. Those girls were acting suspicious and I have the authority to." "You have the authority to verify tickets," Victoria had said, her voice still quiet but somehow cutting through Brenda's protests like a knife through butter. "You have the authority to call supervisors if you suspect fraud. You do not have the authority to drag children by their hair. You do not have the authority to make them bleed. You do not have the authority to lock them in a room for 47 minutes. And you absolutely do not have the authority to assault minors because their blackness offends you." The handcuffs had clicked around Brenda's wrists with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the hushed terminal, metal on bone, the physical manifestation of consequences that Brenda had assumed would never touch her, that her whiteness and her uniform and her 23 years of service would protect her from. She'd struggled against the security officers, not physically fighting but trying to pull away, trying to maintain some shred of dignity as she was arrested in front of the colleagues she'd worked with for over 2 decades, in front of the passengers she'd been serving just an hour ago, in front of the black girls she'd brutalized who were now watching her destruction with faces that showed not triumph but exhausted grief. "I have a family," Brenda had wailed as the officers began leading her away from the gate desk. "I have grandchildren. You're ruining my life over a misunderstanding. I didn't mean to hurt them. They were resisting and I just..." "My daughters have a family too," Victoria had said, and something in her tone had made the security officers pause, had made everyone in the gate area stop and listen, and that family just watched security footage of you grabbing an 11-year-old child by her braids and dragging her across a terminal. "We watched you rip hair from her scalp. We watched you make her bleed. We watched you lock her and her sister in a room while they cried. So don't you dare talk to me about your family or your grandchildren or your life being ruined." She'd stepped closer to Brenda then, close enough that the gate agent could see the tears Victoria had been holding back, could see the fury and grief and protective rage of a mother who'd failed to keep her children safe from the world's cruelty. "You ruined your own life the moment you decided my daughters were less than human," Victoria had said quietly, "and now you get to live with that choice for the next 6 to 10 years in a federal prison." The security officers had resumed walking then, leading Brenda toward the terminal exit where police were waiting, and with each step Brenda's protests had grown more desperate, more incoherent, the reality of her situation finally breaking through whatever delusions had protected her from consequences for her entire 51 years. Other passengers had watched her perp walk with expressions ranging from satisfaction to discomfort to shame, some of them perhaps recognizing their own complicity in their silence, some of them maybe wondering if that could have been them, if their own barely concealed prejudices might someday be exposed under less forgiving lights. Zoe and Ivy had watched too, still holding their mother's hands, still processing that the woman who'd seemed so powerful and threatening an hour ago was now being led away in handcuffs, was now facing the kind of consequences that black people were told to just accept when they happened to them but that white people treated as unthinkable injustices when they happened to white perpetrators. "Is she really going to jail, Mama?" Ivy had whispered, her voice carrying a complexity of emotions that no 11-year-old should have to navigate, relief and sadness and something that might have been pity all tangled together. Yes, baby, Victoria had said, kneeling down again so she could look both daughters in the eyes. She's going to jail because what she did to you was a crime, was assault, was something no person should ever do to children, and I need you both to understand that her going to jail doesn't undo what happened, doesn't heal your scalps or restore your hair or erase the memory of being hurt, but it means she can't do this to anyone else. It means the next black girls who walk through this airport won't have to be afraid of her. The terminal director had approached carefully, his expression showing the kind of professional distress that comes from a major incident occurring on your watch, from knowing that federal investigators would be combing through procedures and policies and training records, from understanding that this would define the rest of his career one way or another. Mrs. Palmer, he'd said, we have a private room where your daughters can rest, we have medical personnel standing by to document their injuries, and we've arranged for a private car to take you wherever you need to go. Your flight to Los Angeles has been canceled obviously, but we can rebook you for tomorrow or... We're going to the hospital, Victoria had said firmly. My daughters need proper medical attention. They need their injuries photographed and documented. They need to be examined by doctors who can testify in court about what was done to them, and then we're going home because they've been through enough trauma for one day. She'd stood and gathered both girls close, one arm around each of them, her designer suit probably ruined from kneeling on dirty floors and holding crying children but not caring even slightly because clothes could be replaced and her babies couldn't. The terminal director had nodded and gestured to one of the executives who'd immediately pulled out a phone to arrange transportation and notify the hospital they were coming. Around them the gate area had slowly begun returning to normal operations, other flights boarding, passengers moving through their travel routines, the world continuing despite the violence that had just been exposed and addressed. But some passengers lingered, some of the people who'd watched and filmed and stayed silent now approaching Victoria with expressions of guilt and shame. A young white woman who'd been one of the first to pull out her phone came forward hesitantly, her face showing genuine remorse. I'm so sorry, she'd said to Victoria, to the girls, to anyone who would listen. I recorded what happened but I didn't speak up, I didn't try to stop her. I just stood there filming and she trailed off because there was no good ending to that sentence, no justification that would make her silence acceptable. You have that footage, Victoria had asked, her voice neutral, not absolving but not condemning either. Yes, ma'am, the woman had said, pulling out her phone. I already sent it to the airline and I posted it on social media. It's been shared thousands of times in the last hour, everyone can see what she did. Good, Victoria had said, because the more people who see it, the harder it will be for anyone to claim this was an isolated incident or a misunderstanding or anything other than what it obviously was. The more witnesses we have, the stronger the case against her becomes. An elderly black man had approached next, the same man who'd shaken his head sadly and kept walking during the initial confrontation, and his face showed a different kind of shame, the guilt of someone who'd recognized injustice and chosen safety over solidarity. I should have stopped, he'd said, his voice rough with emotion. I'm 73 years old, I lived through segregation, I marched in the 60s, I know better than to stay silent when I see our children being hurt, and I walked right past you babies like a coward. Ivy had looked up at him with eyes still red from crying, this old man who carried his own trauma and his own history, and something in her 11-year-old heart had understood that sometimes survival meant keeping your head down, that sometimes choosing your battles was how you lived long enough to fight another day. It's okay, she'd said softly, you were scared, I understand being scared. The old man's eyes had filled with tears and he'd nodded, unable to speak, and Victoria had reached out and squeezed his hand because she understood too, understood that black people carried generations of trauma that sometimes made courage impossible, that paralyzed you with memories of times when speaking up had gotten people killed. The hospital had been expecting them, alerted by the airline that they were bringing in 2 minors with documented assault injuries that would likely become evidence in a criminal case. Victoria had walked through the emergency room entrance still holding both daughters' hands, still maintaining that physical connection that told them mama's here and mama won't let go, and the triage nurse had taken one look at the girls' destroyed braids and bloody scalps and immediately escalated them to a private examination room. Dr. Jennifer Chen had been the attending physician, a woman in her mid-40s with 2 daughters of her own and a face that showed genuine compassion rather than clinical detachment when she'd seen what had been done to Zoe and Ivy. She'd introduced herself gently, had knelt down to the girl's eye level rather than towering over them the way Brenda had asked permission before touching their hair in a way that acknowledged their bodily autonomy had already been violated once today. "I need to examine your scalps and document your injuries," Dr. Chen had said softly, "and I'm not going to lie to you, it might hurt a little bit when I clean the wounds, but I promise to be as gentle as I possibly can, and your mom can stay right here holding your hands the whole time." Ivy had nodded and squeezed Victoria's hand tighter, her body tensing in anticipation of more pain, more invasion, more adults doing things to her without her real consent even if they were asking nicely first. Zoe had stayed quiet but her jaw was clenched, her 14-year-old pride fighting against the tears that kept threatening to fall, trying to be strong for her little sister even though she was just as scared and hurt and traumatized. The examination had been thorough and professional, Dr. Chen's gloved hands moving carefully through the ruins of Victoria's braiding work, cataloging each injury with clinical precision while her face showed the human horror underneath the medical training. Multiple areas of traumatic alopecia, she dictated to the nurse taking notes, visible scalp lacerations consistent with forceful hair pulling, contusions and hematomas at the hairline, several patches where hair has been completely avulsed from the follicles. Each medical term had felt like another indictment, another piece of evidence, another way of saying a grown woman did this to children on purpose. Victoria had watched the documentation process with a mixture of grief and grim satisfaction, grief that her babies had to endure more poking and prodding and pain, satisfaction that every injury was being photographed and recorded and turned into ammunition for the prosecution that would ensure Brenda Holloway never touched another child. "Will their hair grow back?" Victoria had asked quietly, the question that had been haunting her since she'd first seen the damage, the worry that Brenda hadn't just hurt her daughters but had permanently marked them, had left scars they'd carry visible on their heads for the rest of their lives. Dr. Chen had paused in her examination and met Victoria's eyes with an expression that was both honest and kind. "Most of it will grow back completely," she'd said. "The areas where hair was pulled out but the follicles weren't destroyed should regenerate normally within 6 to 8 months. But there are a few spots here and here," she'd pointed gently at patches on both girls' scalps, "where the trauma was severe enough that we might see some permanent hair loss or scarring." The words had landed like blows even though Victoria had half expected them, the confirmation that Brenda's violence would mark her daughters forever, that years from now when Zoe and Ivy looked in the mirror they might see small reminders of the day a woman hated them enough to rip out their hair. Ivy had started crying again, quiet tears that spoke to understanding that some damage couldn't be undone, that sometimes hurt left permanent marks. "But baby," Dr. Chen had added quickly, seeing Ivy's tears, "there are treatments we can try, medications and therapies that promote hair regrowth, and even if some small areas don't fully recover, a good stylist can work with your natural hair to cover any scars. You're going to be beautiful no matter what, I promise you that." It wasn't enough, would never be enough, but it was something, was hope in the face of permanent damage, was the possibility that maybe this wouldn't define them forever. Victoria had pulled Ivy into her lap despite the girl being almost too big for it, had held her while Dr. Chen finished the examination and the photographer documented every angle of every injury, creating a visual record that would later fill courtrooms and news broadcasts and the nightmares of everyone who saw what hatred looked like when it attacked children. Zoe's injuries had been similarly documented, the older girl sitting stoically through the process but her hands gripping the examination table edge so hard her knuckles went white, her body rigid with the effort of not breaking down completely. When Dr. Chen had finished and stepped back, Zoe had finally let the tears fall, silent streams down her face that she didn't bother wiping away, exhaustion and pain and trauma finally overwhelming her 14-year-old determination to be strong. "You were both very brave," Dr. Chen had said as she'd removed her gloves, "braver than most adults I see in here, and I know that doesn't make it hurt less, but I want you to know that your courage in letting us document everything is going to help make sure that woman faces real consequences." The nurse had brought them juice boxes and graham crackers, the kind of simple comfort food that hospitals keep for children, and Ivy had accepted hers with a whispered thank you that broke Victoria's heart all over again because her baby was still being polite, still saying please and thank you, still trying to be good even after the world had just proven that being good didn't protect you from cruelty. "We're prescribing antibiotics for the scalp wounds to prevent infection," Dr. Chen had told Victoria, handing her several prescriptions and a thick packet of aftercare instructions, and I'm also writing a referral for a child trauma therapist because what your daughters experienced today wasn't just physical assault, it was psychological trauma that they're going to need help processing. Victoria had accepted the papers with shaking hands, the reality hitting her that this wasn't over, that the hospital visit was just the beginning of a long recovery process, that her daughters would be dealing with the aftermath of Brenda Holloway's hatred for months or maybe years to come. The thought of Zoe and Ivy needing therapy, of them having nightmares and anxiety and fear around authority figures, of this single incident potentially shaping how they moved through the world for the rest of their lives, made Victoria want to scream with rage at the unfairness of it all. A victim advocate had appeared then, a kind-faced black woman named Monica who specialized in working with families navigating the criminal justice system after violent crimes. She'd sat with them in the examination room and explained what would happen next, the police reports and district attorney meetings and eventual trial, the long, slow process of seeking justice through a system that wasn't designed to protect black children but that they'd forced to work anyway through sheer documentation and public pressure. Your daughters are going to have to testify, Monica had said gently, looking at Zoe and Ivy with sympathy. They're going to have to tell their story to prosecutors and possibly to a jury. They're going to have to relive this experience multiple times as we build the case. And I want you all to know that's going to be hard, it's going to be traumatic, but it's also how we make sure justice happens. Zoe had looked at her mother with exhausted eyes, this 14-year-old who'd had to grow up too fast too many times already. Do we have to, Mama? She'd asked quietly, can't the videos be enough? Do we really have to talk about it over and over? Yes, baby, Victoria had said, pulling both girls close, because if we don't fight, if we don't push for accountability, then Brenda Holloway gets to hurt other children, other families, other little girls who might not have a mama with the resources to fight back the way we can. We do this not just for us, but for every black child who comes after you. And that had settled it, had given their trauma purpose, had transformed their victimhood into a kind of power, the knowledge that their suffering could prevent future suffering, that their voices could protect children they'd never meet. 2 weeks later, the trial had begun, moved to an expedited docket because the evidence was so overwhelming and the public outcry so intense that prosecutors wanted to strike while the case was still dominating headlines and social media feeds. The courtroom had been packed with media and spectators and representatives from civil rights organizations who'd latched onto this case as a symbol of everything wrong with how black children were treated in public spaces. Zoe and Ivy had sat in the front row with their mother, both girls wearing their Sunday best dresses and fresh braids that Victoria had redone herself, carefully working around the healing wounds and the patches where hair would never grow back. The new braids were longer and more intricate than before, adorned with even more gold beads, a deliberate statement that said you tried to take our crowns but we're still royalty, you tried to destroy our beauty but we're still beautiful. The prosecution had presented their case with methodical precision, building a narrative so clear and damning that even Brenda's own attorney had looked uncomfortable defending her. They'd played the cell phone videos from 7 different angles, the jury watching in silence as Brenda grabbed Ivy's braids and yanked, as the 11-year-old's scream echoed through the courtroom speaker system, as gold beads scattered across terminal floor caught on camera from multiple perspectives. Several jurors had wiped their eyes watching the footage, one middle-aged white woman actually crying openly as she'd watched a child being dragged by her hair, and Ivy had squeezed Victoria's hands so tight it hurt because watching it on the big screen somehow made it worse, made it more real, forced her to relive those moments of terror and pain in excruciating detail. Dr. Chen had testified about the injuries, using blown-up photographs that showed every scalp laceration in graphic detail, explaining to the jury in clinical terms exactly how much force would be required to rip hair from follicles, how deliberate the violence had to be to cause the damage documented in the medical records. This was an accidental contact, she'd said, her professional voice carrying weight that opinion couldn't match. This was sustained forceful pulling consistent with intentional assault. Monica, the victim advocate, had prepared the girls for their testimony, had practiced with them how to stay calm under cross-examination, how to answer questions without getting flustered or angry, how to tell their truth in a way that the jury would hear and believe. But nothing could really prepare a 14-year-old and an 11-year-old for sitting in a witness box in front of strangers and describing the worst experience of their lives. Zoe had gone first, had walked to the witness stand with her head high and her shoulders back, channeling every ounce of her mother's strength and her grandmother's dignity. She told her story in a voice that only shook a little bit, had described the interrogation and the accusations and the way Brenda had grabbed her hair and dragged her, had looked directly at the jury when she'd said, "I thought she was going to kill us. I thought we were going to die in that airport and nobody was going to help us." The defense attorney had tried to shake her testimony, had suggested that maybe the girls had been rude or confrontational, had implied that perhaps Brenda had only used necessary force to restrain unruly minors. But Zoe had held firm, had pointed to the videos playing on loop and said, "Does that look like necessary force to you? Does an 11-year-old child crying for her mama look like someone who needs to be dragged by her hair?" Ivy's testimony had been shorter but somehow more devastating. This small girl in her braids and dress describing how her mama had spent 3 hours on her hair the night before, how the beads had been a gift from her grandmother, how she'd felt so pretty that morning and so destroyed by afternoon. "She ruined something my mama made for me," Ivy had said, her voice breaking. "She took something beautiful and made it hurt. And I don't understand why she hated us so much when we didn't do anything wrong." Several jurors had been crying openly by the time Ivy finished, and even the judge had needed a moment to compose herself before calling for a brief recess. Brenda had sat at the defense table looking smaller and older than she had at the airport, her face showing some combination of defiance and dawning realization that no jury was going to side with a woman who'd brutalized children on camera. The defense had tried to present character witnesses, colleagues who testified that Brenda had been a good employee for 23 years, family members who insisted she wasn't racist, that she had black friends and had never shown prejudice before. But the prosecution had countered with the 16 complaints filed against her over the years, all from black passengers, all dismissed or ignored by supervisors who'd chosen to believe a white employee over black customers reporting discrimination. The pattern was undeniable, the evidence overwhelming, the videos impossible to explain away. When closing arguments finished and the jury filed out to deliberate, Victoria had pulled her daughters close and whispered, "You did so good, babies. You told the truth and that's all anyone can ask." The jury had taken 90 minutes. Long enough to seem serious but short enough to signal they'd never really doubted. When they'd filed back in and the forewoman had stood to deliver the verdict, the courtroom had gone silent enough to hear breathing, to hear hearts beating, to hear the weight of justice either arriving or being denied once again. "Guilty on 2 counts of assault on a minor," the forewoman had said, her voice clear and certain. "Guilty on 1 count of civil rights violation. Guilty on 1 count of false imprisonment." Brenda had collapsed at the defense table, her face in her hands, her body shaking with sobs that might have been remorse but looked more like self-pity. Her family in the gallery had started crying too, her adult children who'd presumably benefited from their mother's income and now would watch her go to prison, her elderly mother who couldn't reconcile the daughter she'd raised with the woman the evidence had revealed. The judge had been a black woman named Honorable Patricia Williams, 61 years old with gray-streaked locks that she wore natural and unapologetic, a woman who'd spent 30 years on the bench watching the criminal justice system fail black people over and over but who still believed in using what power she had to create accountability when the evidence allowed it. She'd looked at Brenda Holloway with an expression that held no sympathy, no softness, no inclination toward the kind of leniency that white defendants so often received when their victims were black. "Ms. Holloway," Judge Williams had said, her voice filling the courtroom with the authority of someone who'd earned every ounce of her power through brilliance and perseverance, "You attacked 2 children because their blackness offended you, because you saw black girls in first class and your racism couldn't tolerate their presence in a space you decided belonged to white people. You grabbed their hair that in black culture represents heritage and beauty and generational love, and you ripped it from their scalps like you were entitled to destroy what their mother had created." She'd paused to let the words settle, to let everyone in the courtroom sit with the full weight of what Brenda had done. "You desecrated something sacred because you believed your hatred gave you the right," Judge Williams had continued. "You traumatized children who will carry scars both physical and psychological for the rest of their lives. You violated their dignity and their safety and their fundamental right to exist in public spaces without being brutalized. And you did all of this in front of hundreds of witnesses who will now have to examine their own complicity in staying silent." Brenda had tried to speak, had opened her mouth to offer some final plea for mercy, but Judge Williams had held up a hand and the gate agent had fallen silent. 6 years in federal prison, the judge had pronounced, no possibility of parole, and upon your release you are permanently banned from working in any public-facing position where you might have authority over vulnerable populations. You will be required to register as someone convicted of crimes against children, and you will carry the consequences of your choices for the rest of your life. The gavel had come down with a sound like thunder, like finality, like the universe occasionally delivering justice even when it so often failed to. Brenda had collapsed completely then, her sobs echoing through the courtroom, her family weeping in the gallery, the whole scene playing out like a morality tale about the wages of hatred. Victoria had watched from her seat with Zoe on one side and Ivy on the other, both girls wearing fresh braids that had taken her 4 hours this time, longer and more beautiful and more defiant than before. She'd felt no triumph watching Brenda's breakdown, no satisfaction in seeing a woman destroyed, just exhaustion and grief that it had come to this, that her daughters had to be hurt before anyone with power decided black children's pain mattered enough to act. Outside the courthouse, reporters had swarmed as expected, cameras and microphones, and shouted questions about justice and accountability and what message this sent. Victoria had stood on the courthouse steps with a daughter on each side, their matching braids clicking softly with gold beads, 3 generations of black women's resilience concentrated in that moment. Mrs. Palmer, what message do you want other parents to take from this? A reporter had called out. Victoria had looked at her daughters, at their healed scalps and their stronger voices and the trauma they'd survived, then back at the cameras. My children were attacked because someone decided they didn't belong in first class, she'd said, her voice steady and clear, but my babies belong everywhere, first class and boardrooms and stages and the White House, anywhere they want to be. And to every black mother watching, our children's hair is not a threat, it's a crown, it's our heritage and our beauty and our resistance, and anyone who tries to take it will answer to us. The clip had gone viral within hours, #ProtectBlackGirls trending for days, news outlets playing it on loop, social media filled with black mothers and daughters posting photos of their own braids and locks and twists, reclaiming the narrative that their hair was beautiful and powerful and nothing to apologize for. 3 months later, Victoria had launched the Crown Project through Luminance Beauty, a nationwide initiative providing free hair care services and self-esteem workshops for young black girls, turning her daughters' trauma into a movement, transforming their pain into power that would protect children they'd never meet. The first workshop had been held in Atlanta, the room packed with black girls from ages 8 to 18, their mothers and grandmothers filling the seats around them. Zoe and Ivy had stood at the front sharing their story, no longer victims but survivors, no longer broken but healing, their voices stronger now with practice and purpose. A lady tried to take my crown, Ivy had said into the microphone, her 12-year-old voice carrying through the room with confidence that hadn't existed 6 months ago. She ripped it from my head, she made me bleed, she tried to make me feel like I was nothing, but my mama fixed it, and now my crown is bigger than ever. And she touched her braids with pride that made the entire room erupt in applause. Nobody can take who you are, Ivy had continued when the clapping died down. They can hurt you and they can hate you and they can try to break you, but if you remember that you're royalty, if you hold on to your crown even when they're trying to rip it off, you survive, you heal, you win. The room had erupted again, young black girls cheering and touching their own hair, their own crowns, understanding in that moment that their natural hair wasn't something to hide or straighten or apologize for, but something to celebrate and protect and wear with fierce pride. And if you've watched Zoe and Ivy's entire journey and you haven't subscribed yet, if you haven't hit that like button, if you're not sharing this story with every parent and every child who needs to understand that black hair is sacred and violence against black children must have consequences, then what are you waiting for? Subscribe right now, because stories like this need to be amplified and remembered and used to create change, because the next black girl who gets attacked might not have it. So mother or might not survive with as much grace. Hit subscribe and join us in protecting black children and demanding accountability. Victoria had watched from the back of the room with her own mother beside her, this 74-year-old woman who'd survived segregation and Jim Crow and raised her daughter to be unstoppable. You raised them right, Victoria, her mother had said. They bend but they don't break, just like you taught them, just like I taught you. That night Victoria had sat on the edge of Ivy's bed continuing their nightly ritual of oiling her scalp, gentle fingers working through the braids, touching the healed scars that would never fully disappear. "Mama," Ivy had asked sleepily, "do you think that lady learned her lesson? Do you think she's sorry?" Victoria had considered the question carefully, unwilling to lie but wanting to give her daughter hope. "I don't know, baby," she'd said honestly. "Some people hold onto their hate forever, but that's their burden, not yours. You get to choose love and grace, and that's how we win." Ivy had smiled and closed her eyes, safe in her mother's hands, safe in her own skin, still healing but no longer broken. And 3 states away in a federal prison, Brenda Holloway had lain awake in her cell staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment she'd grabbed those braids, 6 years stretching ahead of her like a desert, 6 years to remember the screams, 6 years to understand what she'd destroyed and what she could never take back, 6 years to learn that hatred is heavy and some crowns can never be stolen no matter how hard you try.